I still remember that morning clearly. Scout, the old Labrador, who had been with me for more than 12 years, suddenly rushed into the forest and disappeared longer than usual. His barking came in rapid bursts, but it did not sound like when he was chasing deer or scaring off bears. It sounded as if he was trying to call me over as quickly as possible. I froze when I saw Scout struggling to drag a young Bigfoot, covered in mud and rotten leaves, from the edge of the forest toward the house. My name is Walter Hayes. This year I am 68 years old. I worked as a carpenter for nearly 40 years before retiring and moving into an old cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. After my wife passed away from illness, and then years later my only daughter died in a traffic accident, my life slowly narrowed down to the pine forest, pieces of wood, and silence. I did not hate people. I simply no longer knew how to begin new conversations. My closest friend now was Scout, an old Labrador who had been by my side for more than 12 years. Every morning, we walked along the trail behind the cabin. I used to think the rest of my days would pass quietly in that rhythm until the morning after a heavy rain, when Scout brought home something I had never dared believe was real in my entire life. I woke up very early, as I did every day, while the mist still covered the Cascade slopes behind my old cabin. After a night of heavy rain, the air in the forest carried the smell of damp pine and freshly turned earth, a familiar scent that had followed me through decades of living in this place. I carried my axe into the front yard to finish splitting the pile of firewood left from the day before, while Scout slowly moved around the edge of the woods, sniffing and wagging his tail, which had turned gray with age. He was no longer as quick as when he was young, but he still kept the habit of checking the forest each morning before returning to sit beside me and wait for breakfast. That was why, when I saw Scout suddenly snap his head up and rush straight between the pine trees with a speed I had not seen in him for a very long time, I only thought he had probably found a deer or a mountain weasel. I kept working for a few more minutes, then suddenly realized the forest had become strangely quiet. Normally, Scout would come back quickly, or at least I would hear his footsteps on the layer of rotting leaves. That day, too much time passed, and an uneasy feeling began to rise inside me, one I could not name. I put the axe down, pulled on a thicker coat, and followed the familiar trail into the forest. After only a few minutes, Scout's barking echoed from far ahead. The sound was not frantic or violent. It carried a strange rhythm, as if he was trying to call one person, and only one person, me. I immediately quickened my steps, splashing through puddles left by the rain and weaving between water-soaked tree trunks. When I crossed a small clearing, I stopped dead. Scout was using every bit of strength he had left to pull a creature covered in mud and rotten leaves from the edge of the forest toward my cabin, with a determination I had never seen in him during all 12 years together. I stood still for a long time, so long that I did not even realize my hand gripping the old hunting rifle had begun to go numb. The creature lying on the ground was only about as tall as a 6-year-old child. Its whole body was covered in dark brown fur, matted tightly with rainwater and mud. Dead leaves stuck to its back and shoulders, making it almost blend into the colors of the forest. One of its legs had been torn open by several long cuts, probably from sliding over sharp rocks after the storm, and the fur around its knee had turned dark with dried blood. Its small chest rose and fell slightly with each heavy breath, enough for me to know it was still alive. Scout remained patiently beside it, sometimes touching the creature's arm with his cold nose as if trying to wake it once more. I slowly moved closer, each step careful, because my mind was still filled with all the stories people had told about Bigfoot for so many years. Even so, when I was only a few steps away, all those old thoughts inside me began to shake. The little Bigfoot moved slightly, and his eyes slowly opened. They were amber eyes, clear but filled with exhaustion and panic. That gaze met mine for less than a second, then immediately shifted into terror. He hurriedly curled up, raising both arms to cover his head, in a very familiar reflex, exactly like a child who had endured violence many times and was trying to protect himself before something terrible happened. That moment made me forget about being cautious. All I could see was a living being drained of strength and carrying fear so deep that it had become instinct. I slowly lowered the rifle to the ground, stepped back to create some distance, then gently squatted down, keeping both hands where he could see them. Scout also lay down beside the small creature, his tail lightly tapping the wet leaves, as if telling him everything would be all right. The little Bigfoot still trembled in waves, but his eyes became a little less tense when he saw that both Scout and I stayed where we were. I sat there for a long time, letting drops of water fall from the pine branches onto my coat, while hundreds of conflicting thoughts circled through my head. If I went back and called the rangers or the county police, this creature would certainly be taken away. They would see this as a shocking discovery, put up barriers, bring in scientists, and this quiet forest would turn into a place where people gathered out of curiosity. I had lived long enough to understand that when something too rare falls into human hands, curiosity usually comes before compassion. I looked at the little Bigfoot curled up on the wet ground, then looked at Scout. The old dog was still close beside him, his eyes following every small movement as if guarding a member of the family. In all 12 years, Scout had never behaved that way with any animal. Maybe age makes people less hasty, or maybe the years of loneliness had taught me to see things differently. I slowly stood up, took a few steps back, then removed the thick coat I was wearing and gently spread it on the ground beside the small creature. I did not touch him. I only placed the coat there like a silent invitation. After a while, he slightly tilted his head to look at the coat, then looked back at me. His eyes still held caution, but I noticed the first panic had softened a little. Scout walked over, lightly bit the edge of the coat, and pulled it closer to the little Bigfoot. Then he looked back at me, as if waiting for the final decision. I let out a very quiet laugh, the kind of laugh that had disappeared from my life many years earlier. "All right, old buddy," I whispered to Scout. "This time I'll listen to you." I leaned the rifle against the base of a tree, knelt down very slowly, and slid both hands under that thin, trembling body. As soon as I lifted him, the little Bigfoot flinched, but then quickly faded into unconsciousness from exhaustion. His body was much lighter than the thick fur made it seem, as if he had been starving for a long time. Scout immediately walked close beside my legs all the way back to the cabin, sometimes looking up to make sure I was still carrying his new friend. When I stepped out from the edge of the forest, I knew the quiet life I had been used to for years had silently turned in a completely different direction. I could not yet imagine what was waiting ahead, but a very clear feeling appeared in my heart. If I let this creature go at that moment, I might regret it for the rest of my life. When I reached the cabin, I did not bring the small creature into the house. I went straight to the shed behind it, the place where I used to store dried wood and repair old things. I lit the stove, added a few dry pine logs, and waited for the warmth to slowly spread through the room. While the flames began to grow, I went back into the house to get the first aid box, several clean towels, an old wool blanket, and a pot of hot water. When I returned to the shed, I realized the little Bigfoot was a bit more awake. He was still curled up, his eyes following every step I took. Each time I came a little closer, his body tightened like a rope pulled too hard. I did not rush. After many years as a carpenter, I understood that every material needed to be handled at its own pace. Fresh wood will crack if forced to bend too quickly, and a wounded life needs even more time to trust. I placed the first aid box on the floor, opened the lid so everything inside was visible, then stepped back a few paces. Only when I saw the Bigfoot was no longer reacting too strongly did I slowly sit down on the wooden chair across from him. We sat like that for quite a while, surrounded by the sound of burning wood and the gentle smell of pine resin filling the room. After a long enough silence, I picked up the towel that had been dipped in warm water and extended my other hand forward, as if letting him know what I was about to do. The little Bigfoot's eyes were still full of caution, but this time he did not move back. I gently wiped the mud from his forearm first, then his shoulder and face. The water in the basin quickly turned cloudy brown. Under the mud, the fur was softer than I had expected, and the skin in the thinner patches of fur was pale gray, very much like wet stone after rain. The wounds on his leg made me frown. Some cuts were fairly deep, mixed with long scrapes caused by rubbing against rock and branches. I used clean water to rinse each wound, carefully removed several tiny pieces of gravel still stuck inside, then applied antiseptic. Every time the medicine touched his skin, the little Bigfoot shivered slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the blanket until his knuckles turned pale. I paused for a few seconds after each step so he had time to calm down before I continued. Scout stayed in the same place, only lifting his head now and then to look at me and then at his little friend, as if trying to reassure both sides at once. After finishing the bandages, I took a large bowl, mixed warm water with a little honey, and placed it on a low stool near the bed. I did not hand it directly to him, I only gently pushed the stool closer. The little Bigfoot looked at the bowl for a long time. His dry, cracked lips moved slightly, but caution still kept him still. I understood that thirst was fighting against fear that had built up for a very long time in his memory. So I quietly stood up, walked toward the door, and turned my back, pretending to check the firewood outside. Only a few seconds later I heard the ceramic bowl lightly touch the edge of the bed. When I looked back, the small creature had lifted the bowl with both hands and was drinking slowly, sip by sip. That afternoon passed more slowly than any day I had experienced in my many years of living alone in the Cascades. After finishing the bowl of honey water, the small creature curled back into the corner of the folding bed, pulled the wool blanket up to his shoulders, and silently watched every movement in the shed. I went to the kitchen and cooked a simple pot of chicken soup with carrots, potatoes, and a little celery left in the garden. It was something I often made when the weather turned cold, because it was easy to eat and helped the body regain strength. When I carried the steaming bowl of soup to the shed, I placed it on the familiar wooden stool and sat down far enough away that the little Bigfoot would not feel cornered. Steam rose from the soup, carrying the gentle smell of chicken broth, and the amber eyes turned slightly toward me. He swallowed very softly, but still did not come closer. I picked up the wooden spoon, scooped a little soup, and ate some myself first. Then I placed the spoon back in the bowl and stood up to add more wood to the stove. Only when my back was turned did I hear very light footsteps on the old wooden floor. When I looked back, the little creature was sitting at the edge of the bed, holding the warm bowl in both hands and carefully raising each spoonful to his mouth. He ate very slowly, as if trying to stretch out a warmth he perhaps had not felt in a very long time. I noticed that each time he swallowed, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, exactly like someone trying to remember the taste of something precious. Scout remained lying nearby, his head resting on his front paws, calmly watching his new friend. Sometimes he gently thumped his tail against the floor, as if satisfied that his plan had finally worked. When the bowl held only a little broth at the bottom, the little creature slowly set it down and suddenly looked toward me. His eyes were still cautious, but for the first time I felt I was no longer being seen as a threat. He lowered his head very slightly, a short gesture, but enough for me to understand he was trying to express something in his own way. I only smiled in return, because there are moments when no words are needed for two completely different beings to understand each other. When night fell, I spread another layer of blanket on the floor and let Scout sleep right beside the folding bed. The old dog was used to sleeping inside the house with me, but that night he chose to stay in the shed. I did not call him in. Before turning off the light, I looked at the little creature one last time. He was not asleep yet. His eyes quietly followed the flames in the stove as if he was trying to get used to a feeling of safety he had never had before. The next morning, when I brought breakfast to the shed, I looked into the eyes silently watching me and smiled. From today on, I'll call you Whisper. The small creature tilted his head as if listening, while Scout immediately wagged his tail with excitement. I did not know whether he understood the meaning of that name or not, but from that moment on, The creature I had thought all my life existed only in old stories had a name, and in a very natural way, he also began to have a place in my silent life. The first days, after Whisper came to my cabin, passed in a steady rhythm, but each day helped me understand a little more about that special creature. I still kept my habit of waking before the sky was fully bright, lighting the fire, making coffee, and carrying a bowl of soup or hot porridge to the shed. Every time I opened the door, I tried to make a little sound first so Whisper would know I was coming, because I quickly realized that what frightened him most was not people but sudden movements. Just a door opening too hard, or a piece of firewood falling to the floor, was enough to make his whole body tense in an instant. After several days of watching him, I discovered that Whisper almost never slept through the night. Every time I came over at midnight to check the stove, I saw those amber eyes still open, reflecting the dim fire. Sometimes he leaned against the wall, with both arms wrapped around his knees. Sometimes he only sat still and looked out the small window facing the dark forest behind the cabin. If he did fall asleep, it was only for a few minutes. The moment a branch scraped the metal roof or an owl called from far away, he immediately woke and scanned the entire room as if waiting for something to happen. I never asked, because I knew there would be no answer in words. But those reactions were enough for me to imagine that before he met Scout and me, Whisper had lived through too long a time in fear. There are memories that do not need to be told. The body remembers them in place of the mind. That reminded me of myself after losing my wife. For months, just hearing a car pass along the dirt road in front of the cabin at midnight would make me wake with a start and sit for hours by the window. Sometimes people carry invisible wounds longer than scars on their skin. Maybe the small creature in front of me was living the same way. I decided not to force Whisper to adjust to my routine. Instead, I changed a few habits to make the shed feel easier for him. I kept the stove burning through the night, so the room always held warmth. I hung a small oil lamp in the corner, just enough light for him to see around the room if he woke. I also fixed the wooden door that often creaked whenever it opened or closed, because I noticed every sudden sound made Whisper tense for a long time afterward. Those changes were small, but they slowly began to work. By the 5th day, when I entered the shed with a bowl of hot soup in my hands, Whisper no longer curled tightly into the corner of the bed like before. He only raised his head to look at me, then quietly glanced toward the stool where I always placed the food each morning. After I stepped back, he came toward the bowl almost immediately. What surprised me most was that after he finished eating, he carefully placed the spoon inside the bowl and carried the bowl back to the exact same place on the wooden stool. The action was very natural, as if someone had once taught him that things should be returned to their place after being used. I stood there looking at the clean bowl, then looked at Whisper sitting quietly beside Scout. A sudden thought appeared in my mind. Perhaps before getting lost in this forest, Whisper had also once had a family, had once been loved, had once been taught the simplest things in life. That thought made me believe even more that what the little creature needed most right now was not questions about where he came from, but simply one more peaceful place where his heart had time to stop being afraid. About 2 weeks after Whisper appeared, the wounds on his leg had begun to close, and the little creature could walk more steadily. I decided to leave the shed door open more often so he could move freely around the yard near the cabin, as long as he stayed within my sight. Most of the day, I continued my usual work in the small woodworking shop beside the porch. After many years as a carpenter, I barely needed to think when holding a chisel or a plane. My hands simply worked by habit, a habit that had settled deep into my muscles. That morning, I was repairing an old rocking chair when I felt someone standing behind me. I turned and saw Whisper watching silently. He stood very still, his eyes focused on every movement of the chisel sliding across the maple wood. From the way I held the hammer, adjusted the angle of the chisel, and let thin curls of wood fall to the floor, everything seemed to fascinate him. I only smiled and continued working, not trying to explain or signal for him to come closer. I wanted curiosity to lead the way. For almost an hour after that, Whisper stayed in the same place. Sometimes he took a few steps closer to see better. Sometimes he bent down, picked up a thin strip of wood that had fallen, and held it up to the light, turning it back and forth, as if studying it. Scout lay stretched out under the workbench, occasionally opening one eye to look at the two of us before drifting back to sleep. Around mid-morning, I stood up and went to the kitchen for water, purposely leaving a few dry branches, a small, dull knife, and some leftover leather cord from a tool sheath repair on the table. When I came back about 20 minutes later, Whisper had left the workshop. I looked around, but did not see him anywhere. Only Scout remained lying there, his tail lightly tapping the floor as if he knew everything was fine. I kept working until afternoon, without thinking much about it. It was only when I was cleaning the workshop before sunset that I found a small object placed neatly on a log behind the woodpile. I picked it up and realized it was a spoon carved from a young maple branch. Its shape was still rough, the handle a little crooked, and the bowl not deep enough to use comfortably. There were still many clumsy cut marks on the surface, showing that the maker had not yet learned how to control the blade evenly. Still, every detail had been completed with care. There was no sign of rushing or doing it just to be done. I held the spoon close to my eyes, turned it over several times, and smiled without realizing it. Whisper was standing at the edge of the porch, half hidden behind a wooden post, quietly watching my reaction. When he saw me look over, he lowered his eyes slightly, like a child, showing an adult the first thing he had made with his own hands. I walked closer, holding the spoon, then took the small pot sitting on the outdoor stove. I scooped a little water and stirred gently. The spoon was clumsy, but it was completely usable. I turned to Whisper, raised my thumb, and nodded slowly. The little creature's face changed at once. His eyes lit up, and his shoulders relaxed as if an invisible weight had lifted from him. He did not run over to receive praise, nor did he become overly excited. He only smiled very softly, then bent down to pick up several more branches and continued carving with the focus I had often seen in new apprentices. From that day on, I began leaving small pieces of wood ready for Whisper whenever I worked. I did not teach him step by step, and I did not hold his hand to guide him. I simply did my work while Whisper watched, remembered, and found his own way to try. What surprised me most was how astonishingly fast he learned. After only a few days, the cuts were cleaner, and the wood surfaces were much smoother. I had trained a few apprentices when I was younger, but I had never seen anyone improve so quickly just by watching. Every time Whisper finished a small item, he placed it quietly in the corner of the workshop like a gift, and I carefully kept every single one. To others, they would only be a few rough wooden objects. To me, they were like the first milestones of a life slowly finding trust in the world again, and proof that between a lonely old man and a creature from legend, a bond can sometimes begin from the simplest things, through patience, observation, and trust in each other. One weekend evening, when the first winds of spring began moving through the Cascade Mountains, carrying the last cold of winter, I finished work in the shop earlier than usual. I put the coffee pot on the stove, made another small pot of soup, and carried it to the shed as I had grown used to doing. I pulled my chair closer to the stove, held the hot cup of coffee in my hands, and unconsciously looked toward the wooden shelf where the old family photo still sat. That picture had been taken during a summer long ago, when Helen was still healthy, and my daughter had not yet turned 15. I picked up the frame, gently worked away the thin layer of dust, and suddenly laughed when I remembered that on the day we took the photo, Scout had been so playful that he knocked the camera over onto the grass. Whisper watched every movement carefully. He did not look at the photo for very long. Instead, he watched my face more, as if trying to read something hidden behind the eyes of an old man. I placed the frame on my knees and slowly began to speak. It had been a very long time since I had told anyone about my family. In truth, there was no one left to tell. Old friends had either moved away or passed on, and I went down into town less and less. Maybe that was why those memories had stayed silent inside me for so many years. I told Whisper about Helen, the woman who always loved putting wildflowers by the window whenever spring came. She loved this forest even more than I did, and always said that if a person knew how to listen, the forest would teach them how to live more slowly. I told him about afternoons when the two of us repaired the fence together, harvested apples from the garden, then sat on the rocking chair and watched the sun disappear behind the pines. Then my voice slowed when I spoke of the time Helen became ill. The long trips to the hospital, the sleepless nights beside her bed, and the helpless feeling of knowing I could not keep the person I loved with me any longer. I stopped for a moment, took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold, then continued telling him about my daughter. She had always wanted to become a teacher, always carrying a kind of energy that made anyone who met her feel happier. After her mother died, the two of us tried to take care of each other, but fate seemed to think that was still not enough. One winter afternoon, on her way back from Seattle, her car had an accident because the road was iced over. The police called me when it was almost morning. With one very short phone call, my whole world seemed to stop from that day on. I did not realize how long I had been speaking. There were details I thought I had forgotten, but once I started talking, every memory came back clearly as if it had happened only yesterday. During all that time, Whisper barely moved. He only sat quietly, both hands on his knees, his eyes never leaving me. When I lowered my head to look down at the cup of coffee in my hands and felt my throat tighten, I suddenly felt a fur-covered hand gently rest on my knee. The touch was very light, almost without force, but enough to make me look up. Whisper looked straight into my eyes with a strange calm. There was no curiosity in that gaze, and no pity either. I only felt a very sincere presence, like Scout quietly lying beside me on sleepless nights without needing to do anything more. I placed my hand over Whisper's hand. The two of us sat like that for a very long time, listening only to the crackling wood in the stove and the wind slipping through the gaps in the old boards outside. What surprised me most was that for the first time in many years of telling the story of Helen and my daughter, I did not cry. The pain was still there, but it no longer crushed my chest the way it had before. I realized I could speak of them with a smile mixed with longing instead of only despair. When I stood to add more wood to the stove, I looked at Whisper and quietly thanked him for sitting there and listening to a talkative old man. The small creature tilted his head, his eyes shining with a familiar gentleness, then gently placed his other hand on his chest. That was a gesture I later came to understand. Whenever Whisper wanted to say he was keeping something important in his heart, he did that. Summer came quickly to the Cascade Mountains, bringing long sunny days and clear blue skies rarely seen after many months of cold rain. I also began to realize that time had passed faster than I thought. It felt like only yesterday I had carried Whisper from the edge of the forest back to the cabin, his body weightless from exhaustion. Yet now the little creature was almost as tall as my shoulder. His thick fur had become healthy and glossy in the sunlight, and his arms were stronger after months of splitting wood, carrying water, and helping me with all kinds of work around the cabin. If I only looked at him from behind, sometimes I felt as if I was looking at a strong young man, rather than the small creature who had once curled up in the corner of the shed on the first day we met. What surprised me most was not the change in his body, but the way Whisper became more and more in tune with the forest. He moved between the trees so lightly that he made almost no sound. Every time we went into the woods together to look for wood or gather mushrooms, Whisper always noticed signs of wild animals long before I did. Just a slight movement of a branch or a faint scent in the wind was enough to make him stop, tilt his head to listen, then smile as if he knew exactly what was happening ahead. I had lived near this forest for nearly 40 years, but I still understood there were sounds and signals the human senses would never reach. Whisper seemed to belong to that world from the moment he was born. Some afternoons, after the work was done, I sat on the porch drinking coffee while Scout slept under the shade of a tree. Whisper would stand at the edge of the forest. For a long time his eyes turned toward the dark green northern mountains. He stood so still that many times I wondered whether he was hearing something I could not hear. The wind only brought the familiar rustle of pine needles to me, but in Whisper's eyes there was always a special focus, as if someone somewhere far away was calling. The first time I walked over and stood beside him, Whisper only turned slightly to look at me, then looked back toward the peaks. He placed his hand on his chest, then slowly extended it forward, as if pointing to a place far beyond sight. I did not fully understand the meaning of that gesture, but I could feel both longing and a hard-to-name uncertainty inside it. Ever since the day he came back from the Valley of Dried Flowers, I had known that part of Whisper's heart was still turned toward somewhere beyond the forest around the cabin. I simply had not wanted to think much about it then. Selfishly, I kept hoping this peaceful life would last much longer. But day by day, I saw more clearly that Whisper was entering adulthood. He began spending more time exploring areas farther out in the forest. At first it was only a few hours, then almost an entire afternoon. Each time he left, Whisper returned before dark. He always brought a few wild berries, strange flowers, or pieces of beautifully grained wood and placed them on the porch as a gift for me. I never asked where he found them, because what mattered more to me was that each time he came home, there was a little more confidence in his eyes. The confidence of a creature finding himself again. Even so, one thing still made me think. Many evenings after supper, when Scout was asleep and I was cleaning tools in the workshop, Whisper would walk into the front yard and lift his head to look at the star-filled sky. He stood there for a very long time in the faint moonlight, silently listening to the night as if waiting for a signal only he could recognize. I often stood behind the window, watching without saying anything. In my heart, a familiar and unavoidable feeling slowly appeared. It was the feeling of a father realizing that the child he had once carried in his arms was growing up day by day. That child still loved this home, still loved this family, but one day he would have to step outside to find the path that belonged to him. Just thinking about that made my heart heavy. Even though my mind understood clearly that true love has never meant keeping someone beside you forever. A few days later, a heavy rain lasting all night made the stream behind the cabin rise faster than usual. The next morning the sky was clear again, and sunlight reflected on the water in bright sparkling strips through the forest. I decided to use the chance to check the fence on the other side of the stream before the ground dried hard. Whisper came with me as usual, and Scout ran ahead with his familiar excitement. After the rain, the forest seemed full of life. The smell of wet earth mixed with pine needles created a scent I had always loved. As we walked, we picked up a few large branches knocked down by the wind to take back for firewood. When we came near the shallow part of the stream, where the three of us usually crossed, I stopped for a few seconds to watch the water. The level was much higher than the day before, but still low enough to cross. I stepped first, Whisper followed, and Scout quickly moved along a large rock downstream. Everything was normal until a moss-covered rock suddenly turned out to be more slippery than I had thought. Scout placed one paw on it and lost his balance. I only had time to hear his claws scrape hard against the stone before the old dog's body slid into the rushing water. After the rain, the stream was not very wide, but the current was far stronger than it looked. Scout tried to swim toward the bank, but age made his strokes slower than before. In only a few seconds, the water had carried him several yards farther. I immediately ran along the bank, searching for a branch long enough to reach him. There was only one thought in my head. I had to get Scout out before he was swept into the deeper section below. At that moment, from behind me, I heard a powerful splash. Whisper had jumped into the stream almost the instant Scout fell in. The cold water hit him hard, but it did not seem to slow him at all. With only a few strokes, Whisper reached Scout and wrapped one arm around the old dog's chest. He did not try to pull directly against the current. Instead, he skillfully angled his body with the flow, using the current itself to bring both of them closer to the bank. I ran to the nearest point, dropped to my knees, grabbed a tree root, and reached forward. A few seconds later, Whisper got both feet onto the shallow rocks near the edge. I grabbed Scout's collar and pulled hard, while Whisper used all his strength to push from below. The three of us collapsed onto the wet grass beside the stream. Scout lay still for a few seconds, coughed hard, and spat out some water. Only when I saw him begin breathing evenly again did I feel my hands trembling from the tension. I knelt down and gently stroked Scout's soaked fur, still filled with fear at the thought that if we had been only a few moments slower, everything could have been different. Then I looked over at Whisper. The creature was still sitting on the grass, water dripping from his entire body, his eyes fixed on Scout with clear worry. When Scout slowly pushed himself up on his front legs, Whisper immediately moved over and wrapped both arms around the old dog. He pressed his forehead to Scout's head and made low sounds I had never heard before. The sound was steady and gentle, more like comforting than calling. Scout nudged his head into Whisper's shoulder and gently licked the fur-covered arm of his best friend. I stood a few steps away, silently, watching the scene before me, unable to say a word. I suddenly remembered the first day Scout had dragged Whisper from the edge of the forest to the cabin with every bit of strength he had left. Back then, Scout had saved a life. Today, Whisper had rushed into the cold water without a second of hesitation to save the friend who had once saved him. That moment made me understand something very clearly. True gratitude never stays only in memory. It becomes action at the exact moment it is needed most. Looking at Whisper still holding Scout tightly, as if afraid that if he let go his friend would disappear, my eyes stung. I no longer saw a creature from old legends. In front of me was a member of the family, holding his brother with all the love his heart could give. That moment also made me certain that even if one day Whisper left this cabin to return to the life that belonged to him, everything we had been through together would never disappear. It would always remain in the hearts of all three of us as an inseparable part of the small family in the Cascade Forest. After the incident at the stream, life around the cabin slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. But inside me, another quiet feeling grew day by day. Whisper was still with me, still running along the trails with Scout every morning, still helping me split wood, repair fences, and care for the small garden behind the house. But I began to notice that his trips into the forest were becoming longer than before. At first, it was only a few hours in the afternoon. Then it became an entire day. Once, Whisper left the cabin as soon as the sun rose and only returned when the sky had turned orange with sunset. Each time, Scout lay on the porch waiting from very early. The moment he heard the familiar footsteps from the edge of the forest, the old dog would stand up, wag his tail constantly, and run to greet his friend. Whisper always bent down to hug Scout first, then walked toward me with a gentle smile in his eyes. In his hands, he usually carried small gifts from the forest. Some days it was ripe berries from higher ground, the kind I had never seen around the cabin. Some days it was large mushrooms with damp soil still clinging to the base. Sometimes he brought wildflowers with strange colors and carefully placed them in the old vase on the windowsill, exactly where Helen used to put flowers when she was alive. I did not know whether Whisper chose the right place by accident, or had quietly remembered the stories I had told about my wife. Whatever the reason, every time I saw flowers appear in a house that had long known only the smell of wood and coffee, my heart softened. One evening, while the three of us sat on the porch watching the sunset, Whisper took a beautifully shaped piece of wood from behind his back. It was old cedar with the soft grain lines any carpenter would love. He placed it in my hands and smiled with expectation. I understood, so I took the wood into the workshop and began shaping it with a knife and chisel right in front of him. Whisper no longer sat still as before. He picked up his own tools and sat beside me, watching while continuing his own work. All evening, there was only the sound of blades moving over wood and the oil lamp casting light onto the old walls. When I finished carving a small wooden bird, Whisper also placed his work in front of me. It was the shape of a dog with a curved tail that looked very much like Scout. It was still a little rough, but every line had been cared for carefully. I laughed and held the wooden figure down for Scout to smell. The old dog tilted his head and studied it for a while, then gently wagged his tail, as if he recognized himself in the gift. Whisper became so happy that his eyes brightened. That moment made me think of when my daughter was little. Whenever she brought home a drawing or a craft from school, what she wanted most was never simply for us to keep the gift, but to see the proud smile in her parents' eyes. Whisper had that same look of waiting. Time kept passing quietly. I began to notice that Whisper no longer asked me with his eyes each time he wanted to go into the forest. He only lightly touched my shoulder, smiled, and walked away with the confidence of a creature who had found his own instincts again. At first, I still stood on the porch watching until his shape disappeared behind the pines. Later, I only watched for a few seconds before returning to work. It was not because I cared less, but because I had learned how to trust. The feeling was very much like the day I taught my daughter to drive by herself. I was still worried, still wanted to keep her somewhere safe. But I understood that growing up always meant stepping out of the arms of those who loved you. One late summer afternoon, Whisper returned later than usual. When he stepped out of the forest, his fur carried a very different scent, mixing the familiar smell of pine resin with the wild grass of higher mountains to the north. He stood on the porch for a long time, his eyes turned toward the far mountains before slowly coming to sit beside me. I followed his gaze and suddenly understood that somewhere beyond the forests I knew, there was still a world quietly waiting for Whisper to return. That thought made my heart sink for a moment. Still, this time I no longer tried to avoid it. I only gently placed my hand on Whisper's shoulder. He turned to look at me and smiled faintly. Between us, no promise was needed. We both understood that some goodbyes do not begin on the day someone leaves. They begin at the moment we love someone enough to accept that the one we care about deserves to live fully on the path that belongs to them. The signs of change became clearer when autumn began knocking on the door of the forest. The mornings were still warm, but the evenings came faster. The maple leaves gradually turned yellow and red, and the wind carried a chill that warned winter was not far away. Whisper still returned to the cabin regularly, but the time he spent in the forest grew longer. Sometimes I did not see him for 2 full days. The first time that happened, I could barely focus on anything. I repaired a wooden chair all morning and had to take it apart 3 times because I cut the pieces wrong. Scout also lost his usual calm. The old dog kept walking out to the porch, sitting facing the forest, then coming back inside to lie by the door, his ears always raised as if waiting for a familiar sound. Near the end of the second day, when the last sunlight was covering the hillside in front of the cabin, Scout suddenly sprang up and wagged his tail again and again. I looked in the direction he was staring and saw Whisper slowly walking out of the forest. His fur was covered in dry leaves, with a few small pine branches caught on his shoulder, but his face held a strange peace. I stepped closer and brushed the leaves from his shoulder. Whisper smiled, then reached behind his back and brought out a bundle of red berries and several small white flowers I had never seen in this area. He placed everything on the wooden table on the porch and sat down beside Scout as if he had not been away for 2 days. I did not ask Whisper where he had gone. I only placed another bowl of hot soup in front of him, and the 3 of us had dinner together under the familiar yellow light. That night, after Whisper had fallen asleep, I sat alone on the porch for a long time. The sound of insects mixed with the wind moving through the pines made the scene quieter than ever. I remembered the day my daughter received a scholarship and moved to Seattle for college. That night, I also sat on the porch almost until morning. Part of me was happy that she had a chance to follow her dream, but another part of me felt how empty the house would be without her familiar laughter. I realized that what I was feeling now was very much like that day. The only difference was that the one about to leave my life this time was not my daughter, but a creature from the deep forest. The next morning I took the axe behind the house to split wood as usual. Whisper came over to help me stack the split logs into neat rows. As we worked, I suddenly looked at him and realized he was almost as tall as I was. His shoulders had grown much wider, and his steps were strong and steady. I suddenly remembered the first day I had to carry him into the shed because his body was too weak to stand. It felt as if that time had happened only yesterday. And yet now the small creature from those days was strong enough to carry logs larger than the share I usually gave him. I set the axe down, leaned both hands on the wooden handle, and let out a quiet sigh. Whisper seemed to notice my mood. He walked over and stood beside me, tilting his head with concern in his eyes. I smiled and gently placed my hand on his shoulder. I told him I was old now, so sometimes I just liked remembering old things. Whisper listened very carefully, then gently placed his hand on my chest, right over my heart, the same gesture he used whenever he wanted to express something important. I understood that he was trying to say he was still here. I nodded, but deep down I knew that one day, that gesture would only be a beautiful memory. That afternoon, Whisper went into the forest again. This time, before leaving the yard, he turned back and looked at me longer than usual. I raised my hand and waved gently. Whisper also lifted his arm slightly in return, then disappeared behind the tall pines. I stood still, watching until the forest held only scattered patches of sunlight on dry leaves. In that moment, I suddenly understood that mature love always carries a difficult lesson. We can give all our hearts to care for someone, but one day, the right way to love them is to prepare for the moment when we must smile as they walk toward their own life. I no longer tried to hold on to the hope that Whisper would stay at the cabin forever. Instead, I began learning to be grateful that life had given us the chance to meet, to heal each other's wounds, and to create a family I once thought I would never have again after all the losses I had endured. One early autumn morning, while thin mist still hung over the pines around the cabin, I woke early as usual to prepare coffee. Scout was already waiting at the door, but instead of running straight into the yard like every day, he sat still and looked toward the forest with an unusual focus. I opened the door, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the porch. The cool air carried the smell of dry leaves and damp earth after the night rain. As soon as I looked up toward the edge of the forest, I stopped. Under the tall pines, a few dozen steps from the cabin, 3 very large figures stood silently in the pale light of dawn. The distance was far enough that I could only see their shapes, not all the details of their faces. Even so, their height, their bodies, and their dark fur made me understand at once what I was seeing. They were 3 adult Bigfoots. None of them moved closer to the cabin. They only stood still, calmly observing the small yard in front of the house, like visitors who understood the boundary that needed to be respected. My heart beat faster, but what I felt was not fear. It was a deep, hard-to-describe emotion. I turned my head toward the shed just as Whisper stepped out. The moment he saw the 3 figures at the edge of the forest, his whole expression changed. His eyes lit up with a joy I had never seen during all the time he had lived with me. He stood still for a few seconds, took a deep breath, then turned to look at me. In those eyes there were many emotions at once. There was happiness, gratitude, and also the sadness of leaving that both of us had been quietly preparing for. Whisper slowly walked to stand in front of me. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to remember every line on the face of the man who had cared for him all this time. Then he placed his large hand on my chest, right over my heart. It was the familiar gesture he always used for the most important things. This time, I did not have to guess. I knew he was saying thank you. I smiled, though my eyes had begun to sting. I placed my hand over Whisper's hand and nodded gently. I told him it was time for him to go home. My voice was calmer than I had imagined it would be. Maybe it was because over the past few weeks I had learned to accept this moment. Whisper lowered his head slightly, then suddenly hugged me tightly. The hug lasted longer than any before. I felt the warmth of his body, felt his steady breathing pressed against my shoulder, and realized my old arms were holding him tighter than ever. When we let go, neither of us spoke. Scout slowly walked over, rubbed his head against Whisper, and gently wagged his tail. Whisper knelt down and held the old dog for a long time. He stroked the gray-touched golden fur exactly the way he always did after the two of them returned from a walk. Scout touched his wet nose to Whisper's forehead and stood still, looking at his friend with an unbelievably gentle gaze. I had never thought a dog could show so much emotion with only his eyes. Perhaps after everything those two had gone through together, they understood each other in a way people could hardly put into words. Whisper stood, turned, and looked at the cabin one last time. His eyes moved across the porch, the woodshop, the rocking chair, the small garden, then stopped at the shed door, the place that had first become his shelter when he was weak and afraid. I knew every small corner of this place held a part of his memory, just as every corner of this house had become precious memory to me. Whisper stepped back a few paces, then turned and ran toward the three Bigfoots waiting under the pines. The three adults remained where they were, silently waiting until Whisper came close. One of them gently reached out and touched Whisper's shoulder in welcome. Then all four turned and walked into the forest. Before disappearing fully behind the tall pines, Whisper suddenly looked back. Scout and I were still standing on the porch. I raised my hand and waved. Scout let out a bark that echoed through the forest, a clear sound stretching through the quiet morning like a final goodbye to his best friend. Whisper also lifted his arm in return and smiled. Only a few seconds later, the four figures gradually blended into the deep green of the Cascade Forest and vanished from my sight. I remained standing there for a very long time, until the morning sunlight covered the entire yard in front of the cabin. There was a real emptiness in my heart, but beneath that silence was a peace I had not felt in many years. The first days after Whisper left, the cabin became strangely quiet. I still woke before sunrise, still made a pot of hot coffee, still brought food out onto the porch for Scout, then began working in the woodshop as I had for many years. Everything seemed unchanged, but every time I unconsciously turned my head toward the shed or looked at the small wooden stool beside the stove, I noticed the empty space clearly. Scout also needed more time to get used to that absence. Every morning after eating, he still ran to the edge of the forest, stood there for a few minutes, then returned like a habit that had not yet changed. I did not try to pull him back. Perhaps each of us needed our own way to learn acceptance. About a week after our farewell, I opened the cabin door as usual and unexpectedly saw a bundle of very fresh wild mushrooms placed neatly on the wooden step of the porch. The mushrooms were so clean they almost had no soil on them, clearly chosen with great care. I bent down, picked them up, and looked around the misty forest, but saw no one. Scout came over, sniffed the bundle for a few seconds, then immediately raised his head toward the pines, his tail wagging slightly with familiar joy. I smiled without meaning to. There was no need to guess. I knew exactly where that gift had come from. I brought the mushrooms into the kitchen, cooked a large pot of soup, and still set 3 bowls on the table out of old habit. Only when I saw the untouched 3rd bowl did I laugh to myself and put it back in the cabinet. A few weeks later, another gift appeared on the porch. This time it was a piece of cedar with a rare and beautiful grain, exactly the kind of wood I loved most for carving. It was placed neatly by the door, as if whoever brought it knew I would see it first thing when I opened the door in the morning. I used that piece of wood to carve a small bird and placed it on the windowsill beside the family photo. From then on, gifts appeared quietly every few weeks. Sometimes it was a basket of ripe red berries woven from forest vines. Sometimes it was a few branches of wild flowers that bloomed in the season Helen had loved. Once, I even received a bundle of young maple branches with beautifully shaped leaves, perfect for pressing and keeping as a memory. I never once caught the one who brought those gifts. Even so, Scout always reacted the same way. Whenever he woke and caught that familiar scent in the wind, he would run to the porch, stand looking toward the forest, and wag his tail softly for a long time before coming back inside. I often followed behind him, placed my hand on his head, and looked with him toward the pines moving in the wind. It was a strange feeling. Whisper no longer lived with us, but his presence seemed to slip into every small corner around the cabin. One afternoon, while rearranging the shelf in the woodshop, I accidentally found the first spoon Whisper had awkwardly carved from a young maple branch. The handle was still a little crooked, and the bowl was not really balanced, but the surface had become smooth and shiny because I had kept it on my workbench all this time. I held the spoon for a long time and suddenly remembered the first day. Whisper stood hidden behind the wooden post, anxiously waiting for my reaction after giving me that first gift. I smiled, placed the spoon back exactly where it belonged, and continued working. At the beginning of autumn that year, a strong storm suddenly swept through the Cascades for almost 2 days and 2 nights. The wind screamed through the old pines, and rain beat against the cabin roof so hard I could barely sleep. On the 3rd morning, when the sky finally brightened again, I put on a raincoat and stepped outside to check the damage. The scene before me made me stand still for a few seconds. Many large branches had been broken by the wind and lay scattered across the yard. 2 fairly large pine trunks had fallen across the dirt road leading from the cabin to the main trail. I sighed quietly, calculating in my head that with the strength of an old man almost 70 years old, it would probably take me several days to clean everything up. I went back inside to get the chainsaw and a few tools, but when I opened the door the second time to begin the work, I suddenly stopped. The road in front of the cabin was completely clear. The 2 large trunks that had blocked the path only minutes earlier had been pulled neatly to both sides. The smaller branches had also been stacked into piles beside the fence, exactly the way I always did when cleaning the woods after a storm. I stood still and looked at the scene for a long time. Only a few minutes earlier, everything had still been in place. In the short time I had gone inside to get the tools, someone had clearly finished the work that would have taken me hours alone. I slowly walked along the newly cleared road. In the soft ground after the rain, many footprints of different sizes appeared. There were huge footprints from adult individuals, and also a few smaller ones I recognized immediately. Their size was very similar to Whisper's feet the last time I had seen him. The tracks led from the edge of the forest to the yard in front of the cabin, then turned back into the woods. There was no sign of rushing. Everything was neat, as if an entire group had come here together only to help a friend clean up after the storm. My heart suddenly warmed in a way that was hard to describe. I kept walking toward the porch and unexpectedly saw a small object carefully placed in the middle of the step. It was a wooden figure a little taller than my hand. I bent down and lifted it with both hands. One glance was enough for me to know who had made it. The carving lines still carried the familiar simple style I had seen in the first spoon, in the statue of Scout, and in the objects Whisper had made when he first learned to carve wood. This time, the work was far more refined. The figure showed 3 characters sitting together under a large pine tree, an old man with gray hair, a Labrador looking up at his owner, and a young Bigfoot sitting close beside them with one hand resting gently on the man's shoulder. Every line carried patient care. I ran my finger gently across the smooth wood and smiled without realizing it. In that moment, I felt as if Whisper was still standing somewhere among the pines, quietly watching to see whether I recognized his gift. Just like the first day, he shyly brought the wooden spoon and placed it behind the woodpile. Scout walked over beside me, sniffed the figure, then turned his head toward the forest. His tail moved slowly, as if sending a greeting to the friends who had quietly left before dawn. I looked in that direction for a long time. The forest was quiet as always, with only early autumn sunlight slipping through leaves still wet from the rain. I knew I would not see Whisper then. Perhaps he and his family had returned very early after finishing the work. Even so, I nodded gently toward the forest as a thank you. I brought the figure into the cabin, wiped away a few drops of water still on the wood, and placed it on the windowsill, right beside the photo of Helen and my daughter. When I stepped back to look, I realized those three images seemed to belong under the same roof. One side was the family that had walked with me through the first years of my life. The other was the family that fate had unexpectedly brought to me near the end of my life. I sat down in the rocking chair and silently looked at the figure for a very long time. Outside the window, the autumn wind continued to move through the forest, while inside me rose a rare feeling of peace. I understood that some gifts are not made to amaze. They are made to remind a person that the love they once gave is still being kept by someone, no matter how far apart two worlds may be. Time continued to pass in the Cascade Forest's own rhythm. Autumn slowly gave way to winter, then the snow melted and spring returned. I still lived in the old cabin, still spent each morning caring for the small garden, repairing wooden items for a few neighbors in town, and walking with Scout on the familiar trail. From the outside, life looked almost the same as in the years before, but only I understood how deeply everything inside me had changed. Before meeting Whisper, I often thought the final years of my life would only be a quiet time of watching one season pass after another. I finished my daily work only because it was habit, not because I still felt excited to wait for anything. After Whisper appeared and then left, I realized I had begun looking forward to each morning again. I looked forward to opening the cabin door, to see whether another gift from the forest had appeared on the porch. I looked forward to seeing Scout happily raise his head toward the pines whenever he caught a familiar scent in the wind. More importantly, I looked forward to living one more day so I could preserve all the beautiful memories life had unexpectedly given me. One late spring afternoon, I carried the rocking chair out onto the porch and sat watching sunlight pass through the trees. On the windowsill behind me, Whisper's wooden figure still sat beside the family photo. I suddenly realized I no longer kept those two memories in separate places inside my heart. They had become continuing parts of the same life. Helen and my daughter once taught me what love was. Whisper helped me remember that the human heart can still open one more time, even when a person once believed every door had closed. I slowly picked up the wooden figure, used a soft cloth to wipe away the thin dust, and placed it back where it belonged. The cuts in the wood still kept their simple roughness, but the longer I looked at them, the more beautiful they became with time. Perhaps it was because every mark on them was tied to a memory I did not want to lose. Scout lay at my feet, his golden fur now much grayer with age. He could no longer run as fast as before, but each time he heard birds calling from the forest or smelled the wind carrying the familiar scent of pine sap, his tail still moved slightly, as if his heart always believed his old friend was somewhere very near. I no longer tried to ask myself whether I would see Whisper one more time. Life had taught me that every precious relationship needs a reunion to prove it still exists. Some people enter our lives for only a short time, but the effect they leave is large enough to walk with us for the rest of our days. To me, Whisper was exactly that. Many years earlier, if someone had told me that one day I would see a Bigfoot as my son, I probably would have laughed and called it a fantasy. But life always knows how to create things beyond human imagination. It brought a dying creature to my doorstep through the guidance of a loyal old dog. It allowed two lives carrying very different wounds to meet, heal each other, and then continue bravely on their own paths. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the pines, I stood up and looked toward the forest changing color under the sunset. I smiled softly and whispered a thank you for everything that place had given me. Thank you for sending Whisper to me at a time when I thought my life held only loneliness. Thank you for bringing him back to his family when the time had come. Most of all, thank you for letting me understand that true love never disappears after a goodbye. It only changes the way it remains, quietly staying in every memory, every habit, and every peaceful heartbeat whenever we remember those who once made our lives better. Thank you for listening to this story with me until the end. I'm Victor, If Walter's story truly happened somewhere in the Cascade Mountains, I think the most memorable thing is not that he met a Bigfoot. The most memorable thing is the first choice he made when standing before a creature the whole world has always connected with fear. Walter did not see a monster. He saw a life in pain. Sometimes, simply changing the way we look at something in the first few seconds can send both lives in a completely different direction. Maybe that is also why Bigfoot stories always make me think more deeply than people might expect. To me, Bigfoot has never been only a mysterious creature from North American legend. It also represents the things humans do not yet fully understand about nature, humility, and the boundaries we sometimes forget to respect. Many indigenous tribes in the Pacific Northwest have passed down stories for generations about giant beings living deep in the forest. Each tribe has different names and different ways of telling the stories, but one common point is that they often do not see these beings as monsters who only attack. In many legends, they are part of the forest, ancient residents who should be respected just like mountains, rivers, and old-growth woods. If today you are carrying sadness in your heart, if you feel lonely the way Walter did before meeting Whisper, I hope this story reminds you that sometimes the thing that changes your life comes from a completely unexpected meeting. As long as the heart is still wide enough to receive, life always has a way of bringing us things we could never have planned. If you enjoy gentle and emotional stories about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and the mysteries of North American forests, please take a moment to hit like to support this video. Don't forget to subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Story and turn on notifications so you won't miss the newest stories. I would also love to know how you feel. If one day you were Walter and saw a strange creature dying in the forest, would you choose to help or turn away? Share your thoughts in the comments. I always read many of your comments, and maybe your story will inspire a future video. Thank you for staying with me until the final minutes of today's story. I wish you a truly peaceful day. See you again on the next journey of Bigfoot Sasquatch Story.